Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. The Beach Hut. The beach hut was a source of great pleasure to us. Originally, it had been sited halfway down the cliff beside the steps which led to the beach. The cliffs in that particular part of the East Coast were much given to erosion. I can remember the terror which gripped me when I saw a garden on the cliff top gradually being eaten away, plants and shrubs sliding topsy-turvy down the incline. Eventually, the house itself went the same way, but luckily the people who lived in it had moved somewhere safer well before that fateful night. After a few minor landslides, it was deemed prudent to shift the beach hut, and Grandpa was lucky in securing a much better site directly on the promenade, so that we could run straight across the pavement to the lovely hard sand. This meant that we did not have to negotiate the stairs, nor the muddy cliff path, all of which must have resulted in a much cleaner beach hut. The floor was always slightly gritty from our sandy plimsolls, and there was a marvelous salty smell compounded of natural ozone and the creosote with which the exterior was painted once a year. A long cushioned bench stood along the wall, and there were a number of deck chairs and a folding table. On the wall was a cupboard containing such useful things as a tea tin, sugar jar, cups and saucers, and cutlery. There was a first aid tin, too. There were also some cards with which we played Snap and Beggar Your Neighbor, and board games of Snakes and Ladders and Ludo and so on. I expect there were draughts, too, as Grandpa was a dab hand at this game and thoroughly enjoyed huffing his way to swift victory. Here we changed into our bathing clothes and emerged shivering to make the long walk to the sea. Unless the tide were really high, splashing exuberantly about the breakwaters, bathing at Walton meant a long trek through knee-high waves until one could submerge. My parents and grandparents considered it much safer at this stage, and, blue with cold, my sister and I obediently splashed out into the North Sea. Sometimes we paddled instead, and this I much preferred. For one thing, we kept on our comfortable warm clothes, simply stuffing our skirts into garments called our paddling drawers. Our paddling drawers were made of sponge cloth with pink and gray stripes, round us, of course. It must have looked like spinning tops. Some of our youthful fellow paddlers had drawers made of mackintosh, which must have been far more effective. However, we were quite happy with our own garments. What did aggrieve us was the fact that we were not allowed to have metal spades. "So easy to cut off your toes, my dear, with those horrid sharp things," said Grandma. And so we were obliged to struggle on with our sissy wooden tools, whilst children half our age were slicing through the lovely crisp sand and knocking up enormous castles in much less time. We played cricket and tennis on those vast stretches of sandy beach, marking out the lines with our despised spades. We also played a simpler game called French cricket, which involved shielding one's legs with a tennis racket while others tried to hit them with a softball. The worst moments were when the attackers had closed in, and there you were, racket in trembling hands, knees knocking, while the hot breath of the enemy blew the sand from one's legs. Then it was back to the shelter of the beach hut, to the kettle humming on the spirit stove, and lovely sticky buns. There we would be out of the cruel wind which always seemed to blow, however halcyon the weather, straight from Russia. An outing with Grandma. My grandfather owned a plot of land between Walton-on-the-Naze and Frinton-on-Sea. This plot also had a hut on it, and occasionally in the summer we went for a picnic there. My grandmother, whose bulk was impressive, could not walk a great distance, and sometimes a carriage was hired to take her to this picnic spot. I was lucky enough to accompany her one hot afternoon in the carriage, which I think was called a landau, but I am not very well up in carriage lore. In any case, it was an open affair, with seating comfortably for 4 people, and a flight of steps which folded up or were let down to allow easy entry. The seats were of leather and deliciously hot against bare thighs. No doubt I was wearing white socks and white cotton drawers edged with crochet made by Grandma herself. My crochet work was the size and shape of joined-up butter beans and left a red pattern on the back of one's thighs. The driver sat high on a box in front and held the reins in one hand and a whip in the other, not that it was ever used. The horse ambled along while Grandma nodded her veiled toque or lifted her gloved hand to friends as we passed. She had with her a gray parasol of watered silk. At the end of the Malacca handle was a round pink china knob, and on it was a minute scene of an unknown pier and seascape. At our feet was a basket with our picnic tea, and over all lay a snowy linen tea-cloth. The carriage stopped at the side of the road, only a few yards' walk across the field which belonged to Grandpa. Strangely enough, I remember nothing of the hut or the picnic or even of the return journey. But what is unforgettable is that short walk through the field on the edge of the cliff. The sun blazed down upon a sea of scarlet poppies, giving out their hot, peppery scent from the crumpled, papery petals. Lark song spilled from a vivid blue sky above, a sky that merged imperceptibly with the distant blue sea. The air was strong and heady. The grass, brittle and warm, soon clouded my best shoes with dust. Grandma had put up her parasol. Behind us, the driver carried the picnic basket. Holding my hot hand in her own gloved one, we picked our way through the poppies to the delights which I have now forgotten. Later, I believe, Grandpa's plot suffered the fate of so many clifftop properties and slid into the hungry sea one wild night of storm, taking with it the hut, the poppies, the lark nests, and many memories. Going to Grandma's. The journey to visit our grandparents at Walton was quite an adventure. Later, when we were the proud owners of a Ford car, complete with canvas hood and side curtains, we drove from London through Chelmsford and Colchester and arrived in time for tea. But in the early days, we either went by train or by steamer. I much preferred the latter, as Liverpool Street Station was my idea of hell. The noise and filth from the steam trains terrified and upset me. We used to cross a horrifying iron bridge under the grimy glass roof of the station. Below, the trains snorted and puffed out steam and smoke which eddied round one's legs or sometimes hid one's parents from sight, causing agonizing panic. Now and again an ear-splitting scream came from the engines, and men with black faces peered from their sides. They held shovels very often, and the red glare from the firebox heightened the satanic effect. Once we were safely inside the railway compartment, things became a little less fraught. Our cases were put on the rack, including my favorite, made of plaited straw and secured with a strap round it. It was interesting to see the little gardens of the East End trundling by. Some had washing all aglow, some held a poor dog on a chain, or hutches with captive rabbits. Sometimes a lucky free cat squatted foursquare on a wall or on the top of a coal bin, and sometimes small children waved to the train. Later, as the suburbs were left behind, the flat fields of Essex spread away to the coastline. "A penny for the one who sees the sea first," my father would say. And somewhere near Frinton, sure enough, the sea could be glimpsed and the penny won. Once out of the train, the salt sea air engulfed us. We breathed it in great gulps. There was Grandpa bending for a kiss. Grandma was at home preparing a welcoming tea. My sister and I ran ahead down the slope to the new Pier Street, while behind us the grown-ups talked of such dull things as their health, the journey, and the weather. It was far better to go to Walton by sea. In those days, the Bell steamers used to start from Tower Bridge. There were several of these magnificent paddle steamers. There was the Brighton Bell and the Clacton Bell and the Southend Bell. There may have been more bells, but they are the only ones I can recall. Later, I believe there was the Royal Sovereign. They set off from Tower Bridge at 8 o'clock in the morning, so that we had to make an early start whether we set off from Lewisham or, later, from Chelsfield. We traveled on the old London, Southeastern, and Chatham Railway. On each side of the door was a small brass plate like a miniature nutmeg scraper for the use of smokers who ignited their matches on them. A heavy leather strap let down or pulled up the window, and across the bottom of the window frame ran the warning in 2 languages. Do not lean out of the window. Ne pas se pencher dehors. The latter, of course, was for the poor French travelers making for Charing Cross, who might be ignorant of the superior tongue and possibly quite used to putting their heads out of French trains. We passed through all the familiar stations, Orpington, Chislehurst, Hither Green, New Cross, and so on, with the exception of Pett's Wood, which in those days was a somewhat marshy tract with no identifying landmarks. We watched it turn from undistinguished fields to a spreading suburb over the years. It was at London Bridge, if I remember rightly, that we got out. Somehow I connect Billingsgate with our approach to Tower Bridge, but it might well have been on another outing that I marveled at the fish porters balancing towers of fish boxes on their hard, flat hats, with ribbons of gray slime dangling unheeded on each side of their red faces. The steamer had wooden slatted seats on deck, and here we spent most of our time, though hanging over the railings watching the river and then the real sea churning away beneath us was equally enthralling. There was a snug little cabin affair where one could get hot drinks, but it was advisable to give the lavatories a miss if humanly possible, as inevitably some poor wretch would be there feeling seasick. My father, who loved every minute on the steamer, insisted on taking us below to see the engines, which fascinated him. As a very young man, he had spent some time training in Yarrows, the marine engineers, who had then had a shipyard on the Thames, somewhere near Greenwich, I believe. Here he met another young fellow, Chris Reed, who took him home, where he was introduced to Chris's sister Grace, who later became our mother. Father's eyes sparkled as he helped us down and ushered us along gangways between pulsing pistons, turning wheels, and great thumping lumps of metal, gleaming with greeny gold oil and smelling revolting. I think that Father would have stayed there for the whole journey if he had been alone, but family duties took him back to the deck eventually, much to our relief. I suppose we sometimes called it Southend Pier, which was a very long one, but it always seemed to be stranded in miles of glistening gray mud as we churned round the Thames estuary and made northward for the next stop, Clacton. We had a picnic on deck and cups of tea from the little refreshments cabin to warm us up. Our faces glowed from the salt winds, and our hair was in stringy tangles, which were going to be agony to comb through when we arrived. Walton Pier was reached in the afternoon. There was a tremendous racket of engines as the ship edged towards the end of the pier, and much shouting and throwing of enormous greasy hawsers. Then the great paddle steamer nudged its way against the landing stage, and the pier shuddered with the impact. Gangways were heaved into place, and unsteadily we disembarked. Grandpa would be waiting for us, and when we then mounted the pier tram and had the final exhilarating part of the long journey. It was marvelous to trundle over the heaving waters far below us for over a mile, and then to gain the well-known buildings on the esplanade, the turnstile, the automatic machines, and the nostalgic smell of weatherboarding, rusting cast iron, and salt spray mingled together to make a Walton welcome. Our excitement at arriving at Grandma's back door was slightly quelled by Father reminding us to wipe our perfectly clean shoes on the door scraper by the step. It made us realize that no matter how warm was Grandma's hug, nor how splendid the tea spread in readiness, it was here that we had to mind our manners and to be extremely careful not to annoy our grandfather. We knew of old, and had been reminded several times before our arrival, that the freedom we enjoyed at home and at Grandma Reed's was somewhat restricted at 17 New Pier Street. This we accepted. It was all part and parcel of a holiday at Grandma's, and we learned to respect the conditions which were there imposed. 17 New Pier Street. Our first visit upon arriving was to Grandma's bedroom, which was upstairs. I can still remember the lovely smell of Grandma's Erasmic violet soap, its oval shape and beautiful purple color, with which we washed our hands, filthy from the steamer and the tram. Grandpa's soap was on the wooden bath rack which spanned the white bath. His, as befitted such an ascetic character, was plain Lifebuoy, and its fresh carbolic smell mingled with Grandma's erasmic to give an unforgettable fragrance. Next door to the bathroom was the bedroom, which my sister and I shared while we were there. It was a square, sunny room over the kitchen and looked out upon the small, neat garden. Its great attraction for us was the pair of Stafford china dogs, which stood one at each end of the mantelpiece. The double bed was covered with a white honeycomb spread, which I believe was called a Marcella counterpane. They were much in favor at this time, had a fringe at each side, and were easily washed. Our father and mother were housed along the corridor in a bedroom which lay over my grandfather's study. It was not as brilliantly lit as our own, for the one window was partially shaded by the side of the house. The third bedroom was at the front of the building and was considerably larger. Here my grandparents slept, and I remember little about its furnishings, except that the general impact was of larger pieces of well-polished mahogany and curtains discreetly drawn 2/3 of the way across the window. Below this room was the drawing-room dining room, dominated by a large oil painting of a Victorian gentleman in dark clothes. I never knew who he was, but his eyes followed one wherever one stood in the room, which is a little disconcerting. Perhaps he was a chaif, or bat, or even a gunnis. No doubt he ended up in a salesroom, and the handsome gold frame alone should have brought in something. The windows looked out upon the quiet side street, and Grandma frequently sat here watching the neighbors go by as she did her crocheting. Under the stairs stood an armchair, the sort with a carpet seat and painted wooden arms which would fold up. Upon this stood the pile of women's magazines beloved by Grandma, and among them the Home Chats, which would provide us with mental refreshments on Sunday afternoons. Almost opposite the chair was the door and Grandpa's study. Normally, I imagine, it would have been the household's dining room, but here it was the place, as I have explained earlier, where Grandpa retired to write or read his theological articles, or simply took refuge from the mundane world of cooking, cleaning, and the chatter of Grandma's friends. The kitchen, which led directly into the little garden, was the real heart of the house, and had that vivid seaside luminosity which came from the great East Anglian sky. Here Grandma cooked her splendid meals, succulent roasts, shiny brown pies, gooseberry tarts, and bursting sausages. My sister and I squeezed together on a small window seat. My father and mother sat at each end, and Grandma and Grandpa sat in their usual places in front of the gleaming kitchen range. My grandfather always said grace, which we had to remember, as it was unforgivable to pick up a knife and fork before this little ceremony. We also had grace at the end of a meal, and I can still remember the time when my grandfather, knees bent and eyes shut, said grace while holding a milk jug in one hand and a plate of cake in the other. We had had tea in the garden, sitting on the white slated seat there, and he'd begun to clear the table when he remembered that grace had not been said. "We thank thee, O Lord, for this thy bounty. Amen." We echoed the amen. Grandpa's knees straightened, he opened his eyes, and bore the food toward the kitchen. He was an abstemious man, never drinking anything alcoholic, of course, and occasionally singing abstainers' songs, such as, "I like to take a social glass, but only when it is filled with water. It makes the hours so pleasantly pass and fills the air with laughter." I need hardly add that this filled my irreverent father with mirth, which he was prudent enough to suppress in his father's presence. Evidently, as boys, they were given little tracts to show the evil of strong drink. I never had the luck to see one of these, but I gather that you started in the middle with a picture showing two men. One took to drink, and he proceeded from the social glass, not filled with water, and then went reeling home, where he beat his wife and children, and went later, of course, to the pawn shop, where he sold all his household goods for more drink. His family ended up ragged and thin outside the workhouse door, and he lay in the gutter in a dreadful stupor, or else in a pauper's coffin. The other man's family was well dressed and in blooming health, as all its members had in their glasses was what one of my uncles called corporation pop. This man had a large house and garden and a bank account to match. I must say those Victorians had the knack of putting across a message, and I only wish I could have studied it firsthand. Grandpa Schafe also ate very sparingly and never left anything on his plate. He polished it with a piece of dry bread until any remnants of his first course had vanished. He then turned his plate over and was ready for a slice of apple tart or a little cheese with a dry biscuit. What happened when the pudding, of course, of stewed fruit and custard or sloshy sort of trifle, I can't think. But I imagine that Grandma prevailed upon him to have another plate on those occasions. It was a very pleasant house, and I think they had chosen well for their retirement. Not only was it in Grandpa's beloved Walton and near the beach, but it was a compact, well-built house which Grandma could run easily. It was amazingly light. The woodwork and walls were lighter than in my Grandma Reed's house, and the curtains less heavy. Looking back and comparing the two, it seemed to me that the house in Hillier Green Lane was a Victorian one, and furnished in Victorian style, somber and heavy. Grandma Schafe, some 14 years younger than Grandma Reed, was still comparatively young when Edward VII came to the throne, and perhaps some of the gaiety of that era was reflected in the furnishings which appealed to her, and which she enjoyed buying at the time they came for retirement in 1914. In any case, the very atmosphere surrounding the two houses was startlingly different. The air of London was thick with the smoke of 1,000 domestic as well as industrial chimneys, and Walton on the Naze that had clear air and fresh sunlight, and which was reflected from the vast sea and the sands which bounded it. No wonder we returned from our holidays in high spirits. And we will look further into those holidays next time.